Number 1. Mark Winger. Donna Ellen Winger was the kind of woman everyone admired. At 32, she balanced life as a new mother and a devoted wife in Springfield, Illinois. Friends described her as calm, gentle, and loyal, a woman who seemed to have everything: a steady marriage, a new baby, and a home filled with promise. Her husband, Mark Allen Winger, worked as a nuclear engineer at the nearby power plant. To neighbors, they looked like the picture of stability, the kind of couple you'd trust to watch your child or lend you a tool from the garage. But behind that calm surface, Mark's mind was turning towards something darker. It began on August 23, 1995. Donna had just returned home from a trip to Florida. The shuttle driver assigned to bring her home from the St. Louis airport was a 27-year-old man named Roger Harrington. He was chatty, maybe too chatty, and during the drive, he made comments that left Donna deeply uncomfortable. She came home shaken and told Mark about the experience. Mark immediately called the shuttle company to complain. At first, it seemed like a protective husband's reaction. But what no one knew then was that Mark would later use that same driver, the very man his wife feared, as part of a deadly plan. 6 days later, on August 29th, Roger Harrington showed up at the Winger home. In his car, investigators would later find a handwritten note with Mark's name, address, and the time 4:30 p.m., proof that the meeting had been arranged. Mark had invited him there, telling Roger he wanted to discuss the complaint face-to-face and clear the air. But it was a setup. Inside the house, Donna was home with their infant daughter. Moments after Roger arrived, she was struck from behind with a hammer, multiple blows to the head that ended her life instantly. Prosecutors would later say that Mark killed his wife first, then turned the weapon on Roger, shooting him twice in the head to make it look like self-defense. When police arrived, Mark claimed that Roger had come into the house and attacked Donna and that he, Mark, had shot him to protect her. The scene seemed to support his story: 2 bodies, a hammer, a gun, and a panicked husband who had dialed 911. Within a day, authorities ruled it self-defense. For the next 4 years, Mark Winger lived as a widower raising his daughter, collecting sympathy from friends and coworkers. During that time, he also collected approximately $150,000 from a life insurance policy on Donna. But beneath that surface, cracks began to form. In 1999, Donna's close friend, Deanne Schultz, came forward. She revealed that she and Mark had been having an affair, one that had started before Donna's death. Even worse, she said Mark had told her he wanted Donna gone and had spoken about setting up the shuttle driver to make it look like a home invasion. Around that same time, detectives re-examined old evidence, including Polaroid photographs from the day of the crime. Those photos showed the bodies and weapons positioned in ways that didn't match Mark's self-defense story. The entire scene, they realized, had been staged. Armed with the new evidence, prosecutors reopened the case. On August 23, 2001, exactly 6 years after the crime, Mark Winger was arrested at his workplace and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At trial, in 2002, the prosecution presented a chilling picture: a man who planned to kill his wife for the freedom to continue his affair, and who manipulated a stranger into walking into a death trap. Jurors saw the note from Roger's car, heard Schultz's testimony, and studied the crime scene photos that shattered Mark's story. After just a few hours of deliberation, the jury found Mark Winger guilty. On August 1, 2002, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, he didn't stop scheming. In 2007, Winger was convicted again, this time for soliciting the murder of Deanne Schultz and another former friend who had testified against him. That conviction added 35 more years to his sentence. Over the years, Winger filed appeal after appeal, but the courts have consistently upheld his conviction. His last major appeal was denied in November 2021. Today, Mark Winger remains in prison, the once respected husband whose calculated deception shattered 3 lives, his wife's, his daughter's, and an innocent man's, all because he believed he could outsmart the truth. Number 2. Harold Henthorne. To those who knew him, Harold Henthorne was dependable, calm, almost forgettable. That's what made him dangerous. Beneath the calm exterior was a man who'd already buried one wife and was preparing to do it again, this time for more than $4 million in insurance money. On the morning of the 29th of September 2012, in Rocky Mountain National Park, his second wife, Toni Henthorne, fell more than 50 feet off a cliff while the two were hiking to mark their 12th wedding anniversary. Investigators would later discover that Henthorne stood to receive more than $4,500,000 in life insurance proceeds. Henthorne's story with Toni had begun years earlier. Toni was a respected ophthalmologist, originally from Mississippi. When she married Harold in 2003, they settled near Denver. Reports differ on exact ages, but at the time of her death, she was about 50 years old. Harold, however, claimed business success that investigators later found to be largely illusory. He had not held a regular job since the early 1990s, and instead lived off insurance proceeds from his first wife. On that hike in September 2012, Harold and Toni left the Deer Mountain Trail in the national park and climbed off-trail to a rocky overlook. Toni slipped, or was pushed, over the edge around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Harold made the first 911 call at 5:54 p.m., but his actions in the hours before, and the delays in seeking help, raised immediate red flags. Meanwhile, investigators dug deeper and uncovered that Harold had taken out at least 3 life insurance policies on Toni, each valued at $1,500,000, making him beneficiary of roughly $4,500,000 in total. Toni's death opened a Pandora's box. Authorities found a detailed annotated park map in Harold's car, marked with a pink X at the spot where Toni fell. They found that Harold had visited the park numerous times in the preceding weeks, contrasting with his claim of unfamiliarity. They revisited the death of his first wife in 1995. Sandra Lynn Henthorne died when the couple was changing a tire on a rural mountain road and the car fell on her. Henthorne was the sole witness. Authorities later reopened the case after the second wife's killing. In November 2014, a federal grand jury indicted Harold for first-degree murder. His trial proceeded in September 2015, and after about 10.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty. On the 8th of December 2015, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, Toni's family described the chilling betrayal. The man who claimed to love her turned out to have ensured her death from the start. Harold is currently serving his term in federal prison. For Toni's daughter, the memory of a husband's betrayal is hard to reconcile. For the broader community, the case stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers in the night, but from those we trust most. Number 3. Tracy Berles. She was called Pauletta Berles, a woman of faith who stood by her husband's side for years, raising family under the pulpit of the church in Houston's 5th Ward. At 56 years old, she had built a quiet life around worship and home, believing the man she married, her husband, Tracy, was a shepherd in his community. But behind that facade, the life they shared was unraveling. On the evening of May 18, 2010, Pauletta was discovered lying in her driveway, shot to death outside the home she shared with her husband in Houston, Texas. Her body was found with a fatal gunshot wound. The husband, Tracy Berles, a pastor at First New Mount Calvary Baptist Church, reported that he had left the house after an argument and had gone to a convenience store for snacks. When he returned, he claimed he found Pauletta dead outside, but investigators found problems with that story. The store he said he visited had closed before his claimed time of departure. Rather than being a random act of violence, what emerged in the investigation was chilling. Pauletta's husband, Tracy, allegedly recruited their son from a previous relationship, William Fuller, to carry out the act. According to court records, Fuller testified that beginning in 2008, his father urged him, abused him verbally and physically, and told him he would receive a share of the life insurance policy if he killed Pauletta. Investigators say the life insurance policy stood at approximately $60,000. On that night, Pauletta and Tracy were involved in a heated argument in their front yard. Fuller arrived, armed with a gun procured by Tracy's mistress and collaborator, Tyrone Palmer Pollard. According to the appellate opinion, Tracy acted as a distraction to his wife while Fuller walked past them into the house, shot Pauletta in the back of the head, and fled. Palmer Pollard then helped dispose of the murder weapon and aided Fuller in avoiding detection. Prosecutor testimony held. Tracy was indicted for capital murder. Because the state did not pursue the death penalty, the sentencing option was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On September 29, 2011, a jury found him guilty of capital murder. He was automatically sentenced to life without parole. Meanwhile, Palmer Pollard was convicted of murder and evidence tampering for her role. She received a sentence of 7 years plus 10 years probation. Fuller, who testified against his father, pleaded guilty to murder and faced a sentence of approximately 20 years. In the courtroom, prosecutors painted the image of a man of God whose ambition grew darker, his church having burned the week before the shooting, allegations of affairs, and a plan that turned his son into the triggerman. A deacon testified that Tracy had said after the fire, "Now that the church is burned down, I've got one more thing to get rid of." The motive was clear. Eliminate Pauletta to enable the pastor to marry Palmer Pollard and collect the insurance benefit he stood to gain. Fuller testified his father said he refused to leave without her insurance money. Pauletta's life ended that night outside a home that should have been safe. Her husband, her pastor, was convicted of orchestrating her death. The promise of an insurance payout and a new relationship drove the betrayal. The son who once lived under her care turned the gun on his stepmother, and the church walls remained silent to the truth until the jury's verdict. In the end, justice found its mark. Tracy Berles will spend life behind bars, deprived of freedom and the pulpit he once held. But for Pauletta, the wife, the mother, the woman of faith, her story remains a caution of power turned inward, devotion betrayed, and a life extinguished by someone she trusted. Number 4. Isaac Aguigui. In the U.S. Army, reputation means everything, and Isaac Aguigui had built a spotless one. He spoke with confidence, moved with discipline, and looked every bit the soldier others admired. But beneath that uniform was a man driven by control and greed. The choice he made next would destroy his wife, his unborn child, and the image he spent years creating. On July 17, 2011, his wife, 24-year-old Deirdre Wetzker Aguigui, was found unresponsive on the couch of their Fort Stewart apartment in Georgia. She was a sergeant in the U.S. Army, 7 months pregnant, and by all accounts devoted to her husband and their child on the way. When medics arrived, Isaac told them he had just come home from a store and found her lifeless. But what looked like a tragedy soon revealed something far darker. The initial autopsy didn't give clear answers. There were bruises on Deirdre's arms, wrists, and back, even marks suggesting she'd been handcuffed, but no obvious fatal wound. Medical examiners were unsure at first whether she'd been strangled, smothered, or had simply collapsed. Later testimony from experts described signs consistent with asphyxiation and ruled out natural causes. It was not an accident. It was homicide. Investigators began to look closer at Isaac's behavior in the days that followed. Instead of grief, they saw cold calculation. Within weeks, he collected around $500,000 in military death benefits and life insurance payouts tied to Deirdre's service and pregnancy. He spent almost none of it on funeral costs or family support. Instead, prosecutors later proved he used that money to fund weapons, ammunition, and recruitment for a secret anti-government militia he called FEAR, an acronym for Forever Enduring Always Ready. FEAR was made up mostly of disillusioned young soldiers from Fort Stewart. Under Isaac's direction, they began stockpiling semi-automatic rifles, explosives, and gear, plotting what he described as a campaign against the U.S. government. One recruit recalled Aguigui calling himself the nicest cold-blooded murderer you'll ever meet. The group's funding traced straight back to Deirdre's life insurance payout, money born from her death. 5 months later, on December 5, 2011, the same militia carried out another killing. 19-year-old Michael Rourke, a private who'd been part of the group, and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Tiffany York, were found shot to death in a wooded area near the base. Rourke had been planning to leave the army, and Aguigui feared he would expose the malicious plans. According to witness testimony, Aguigui ordered their executions. That double murder finally broke open everything. When investigators pieced the evidence together, the suspicious death of Deirdre, the insurance money, and the killings, Aguigui's entire web collapsed. Soldiers who once followed him turned witness. Forensic experts revisited Deirdre's autopsy and concluded she had likely been strangled or smothered by her husband. In March 2014, a military judge at Fort Stewart found Isaac Aguigui guilty of taking the lives of his wife and their unborn child. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. In separate civilian trials, he was also convicted for ordering the deaths of Michael Rourke and Tiffany York. The money that should have supported Deirdre and their unborn child became the currency of destruction. The husband she trusted used her death to arm himself for rebellion. And the soldier once sworn to protect his country instead built his own battlefield within it. Now serving life behind bars, Isaac Aguigui remains a warning of how power, greed, and control can twist even the most disciplined image. Deirdre's name still stands for the life he took and the future he erased before it ever began. Number 5. Mark Sievers. Morning light filtered through the windows of the Bonita Springs home, but nothing about the next moments would ever feel ordinary again. It was June 28, 2015, a day that began like many others in the life of Dr. Teresa Sievers. By midday, she had cleared a domestic flight and returned home ahead of schedule, apparently to tend her practice and her family. Instead, she would become the victim of one of southwestern Florida's most chilling murder-for-hire plots. Teresa had once been the picture of achievement and calm resolve, a doctor trained in holistic medicine, an attentive mother of 2, and a partner in a medical practice with her husband, Mark Sievers. Her husband, Mark, met her through mutual friends, and they married in 2003. Over the years, the couple lived and worked in Bonita Springs, Florida, where Teresa built a reputation for excellence in service. Her circle knew her as driven, compassionate, with a bedside manner that belied the demands of her job. It was that life she walked into on that fateful evening. But Mark's story had another side. On its surface, he was a successful medical practice partner, a father, a husband. Yet investigators would later show he harbored fear that Teresa was going to take their children away, and ambition tied to several life insurance policies that reportedly covered Teresa. Reports differ on the exact total of coverage, but one source places 5 separate policies at approximately $4,433,000. In the early hours of June 28, a long-planned ambush unfolded. 2 men from Missouri, Curtis Wayne Wright Jr. and Jimmy Ray Rogers, arrived in Florida, allegedly at Mark's instruction, to strike. They disabled alarms, waited for Teresa's return from the airport, and when she stepped into the home, they bludgeoned her to death, 17 hammer blows, according to the prosecution. What appeared to be a domestic return after travel instead became a crime scene. Her body was found the next morning by a family friend called to check on her. When law enforcement first arrived, the investigation zeroed in on the husband. Why else would 2 out-of-state men travel miles to commit such a brutish act unless directed from within? Evidence mounted. Mark's communications with Wright, financial motives, insurance policies, his conduct after the murder. In December of 2015, Mark Sievers was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. At trial in December of 2019, the jury deliberated for about 4 hours before finding Mark guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. On January 3, 2020, Judge Bruce Kyle accepted the jury's unanimous recommendation and sentenced Mark to death. His co-defendants fared differently. Wright took a plea in 2016 and received 25 years. Rogers was convicted in October 2019 of second-degree murder and sentenced December 12, 2019 to life. Today, Mark remains on Florida's death row at the Union Correctional Institution. His defense continues to challenge his conviction, claiming issues with counsel qualifications among other grounds. For Teresa's children, the rupture of trust was visceral. The father who once seemed their protector was now convicted of orchestrating their mother's death. For the community, the case raised sharp questions about greed, betrayal, the hidden costs of wealth and status. A marriage that once seemed solid ended in violence. A life insurance policy meant to protect became a motive to destroy, and the house that should have been a sanctuary became the scene of horror. For Teresa's children, the rupture of trust was visceral. The father who once seemed their protector was now convicted of orchestrating their mother's death. For the community, the case raised sharp questions about greed, betrayal, the hidden costs of wealth and status. A marriage that once seemed solid ended in violence. A life insurance policy meant to protect became a motive to destroy, and the house that should have been a sanctuary became the scene of horror. Number 6. Michael Ralph George. Michael Ralph George had spent years maintaining the image of a quiet, ordinary shop owner, the man behind the counter at Comics World, a small comic book store on Garfield Road in Clinton Township, Michigan. To customers, he seemed harmless, friendly even, the kind of person you might trust to find you a rare edition or let your kid browse for an extra minute. But behind that calm exterior was a husband nursing resentment, financial strain, and an affair he believed could deliver him a new life. On the afternoon of Friday, July 13th, 1990, his wife, 32-year-old Barbara George, was working alone in their store. By 6 p.m., she was lying on the floor of the back room, killed by a single close-range gunshot to the head. When police arrived, Michael said he had been at his mother's house and walked into a robbery in progress. The front display cases were disturbed, a few comic boxes were missing, and the register was open, the kind of scene meant to look chaotic, but not chaotic enough to fool investigators forever. Barbara's death initially went unsolved. Detectives accepted Michael's story that a thief had broken in, killed his wife, and fled. He appeared grief-stricken, but not broken. In the months that followed, he collected $125,000 in life insurance proceeds and filed a property loss claim for 77 missing comics, listing their total value at $12,604. On paper, it was just another robbery case that had turned deadly. Then life went on, or seemed to. Within a short time, Michael grew closer to another woman, Renee Cotula, and by the next decade, they were married. It was a quiet life again, or so it looked, until the old case began to stir back to life. In 2007, detectives reopened the Barbara George file. Advances in forensic review, new interviews, and long-ignored inconsistencies pointed back to Michael. Witnesses said he had been unhappy in his marriage, that he wanted to be free to pursue his affair, and that his supposed alibi the night of the shooting didn't line up as cleanly as it once had. Financial records and insurance documents showed a man who profited immediately after his wife's death. The robbery looked staged. In 2008, Michael George was arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder, insurance fraud, false pretenses, and felony firearm. Prosecutors told the jury he had planned the killing to look like a botched robbery, murdering his wife for both freedom and money. The jury agreed, and he was convicted on all counts. But the story didn't end there. A few years later, his defense argued that police had failed to share certain tip sheet information from the original investigation, and the court granted him a new trial. For Barbara's family, it meant reliving everything again. In October 2011, more than 21 years after Barbara's death, Michael George stood before another jury. This time, prosecutors had a fuller picture: the insurance payments, the staged crime scene, the affair with Renee Cotula. The second jury also found him guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole, plus additional terms for the fraud counts and firearm offense. On appeal, his lawyers pressed again, but the Michigan Court of Appeals affirmed the convictions in May 2013. Later challenges, including a 2024 filing, changed nothing. The life sentence remained. Today, Michael George is still serving that sentence, a man who once sold comic books and dreams, now remembered for the lie he built around a single gunshot and the woman who trusted him. Number 7. Paul Curry. The night air in San Clemente was still on June 9, 1994. when emergency crews were called to a modest home on Camino Capistrano. Inside, 50-year-old Linda Curry lay motionless in bed, a faint smell of chemicals hanging in the room. Her husband, Paul Curry, said he had found her unresponsive. She was rushed to the hospital, but there was nothing anyone could do. To the outside world, it looked like a sudden medical collapse, a quiet woman gone too soon. But in truth, Linda had been dying slowly for months, poisoned from within by someone she trusted completely. In the weeks before her death, Linda had been suffering through an endless cycle of nausea, dizziness, and fainting spells that no doctor could explain. Friends recalled how she kept getting weaker each time she returned from a hospital stay, and how Paul always seemed calm, almost detached. She didn't smoke, rarely drank, and took care of herself. Yet something unseen was draining her life. When she was found that night, tests revealed toxic levels of nicotine and sedatives in her blood, amounts 50 to 100 times greater than those of a habitual smoker. Behind her ear was a tiny injection mark. It wasn't until toxicologists studied her samples that the truth emerged. Linda Curry had been deliberately poisoned with liquid nicotine, a substance so potent that a few drops could stop a heart. Paul Marshall Curry had met Linda years earlier when they both worked at a nuclear power plant. He was intelligent, soft-spoken, and convincing, the kind of man who seemed steady, reliable, safe. They married after a brief courtship, and for nearly 2 years, they lived what appeared to be a quiet suburban life. But investigators would later learn that beneath that calm exterior, Paul was restless, drowning in financial problems, and secretly obsessed with money. After Linda's death, Paul wasted no time collecting her life insurance payouts. He filed claim after claim, ultimately receiving more than $500,000 in insurance and related benefits. To friends, he played the part of a widower in mourning. To police, he appeared cooperative and grief-stricken. There was no forced entry, no immediate evidence of a crime, and for 16 years, the case sat cold. But those who had known Linda never stopped asking questions. In 2007, Orange County investigators reopened the file after new forensic tools became available. They re-examined the toxicology data and reviewed Paul's financial trail. What they found was a pattern of control, unexplained illnesses while Linda was alive, sedatives prescribed and managed by Paul, and an insurance windfall that benefited only him. Detectives tracked Paul to Kansas, where he was living with another woman. In 2010, he was arrested and extradited back to California to face trial. Prosecutors told jurors that Paul Curry was a man who studied details carefully, a nuclear engineer who used his scientific knowledge to administer one of the most difficult poisons to detect. They said he had planned Linda's death for financial gain, calculating every step while she trusted him completely. In September 2014, after weeks of testimony, the jury found Paul Curry guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances of poisoning for financial gain, along with multiple counts of insurance fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Paul Curry remains behind bars, a man who once built his life around precision and control, undone by the same methodical nature that made his crime possible. And Linda Curry's name stands as a reminder of how easily love can be used as cover for the darkest motives. Number 8. Helmouth Bucksbomb. She was known for her quiet devotion, the gentle strength of a mother and community figure. Hannah Bucksbomb, who by all accounts had given her life to raising 6 children and supporting the modest beginnings that their modest family had built, stopped growing after the storms of war and struggle. She was the partner of a man who had arrived from Europe, the woman who anchored a sprawling nursing home empire even as she belied a life built on faith and charity. And yet, one summer afternoon just west of London, Ontario, on a quiet highway shoulder, her life was cut short in a moment that stunned a community. On the morning of the 5th of July 1984, Hannah's car sat by the side of Highway 402, west of London, a small town in southwestern Ontario. That day, Helmouth Bucksbomb pulled over with a young relative. Some reports say the boy was 14. What seemed like an innocent roadside stop became the setting for a deadly ambush. Witnesses say Hannah was pulled from the car, shot 3 times in the head, and left behind on the pavement as her attacker fled. Behind that scene lay a story of success, wealth, secrets, and growing danger. Helmouth had emigrated from East Prussia, later Germany, arriving in Canada and working his way up. He and Hannah married in June 1961, built a business in nursing homes, and eventually became millionaires. Hannah devoted herself to the family, managed home and business interests, while Helmouth presented the facade of the devout philanthropist. But insiders had long seen another side: his mounting debts, cocaine use, numerous liaisons with sex workers, and a growing resentment toward his steady wife. In the months before Hannah's death, Helmouth arranged a life insurance policy in her name. Reports indicate a policy of approximately $1 million was taken out on Hannah shortly before her death. The prosecution later argued that Helmouth paid $10,000 to his hired gunman to kill his wife. On the morning of the killing, Helmouth's car pulled off. He played the Good Samaritan role, and in that ruse, the hitman dragged Hannah out and executed the murder. There were 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters, raised by Hannah and Helmouth. At the time, the Bucksbomb name was respected in the London Komoka area: nursing home operator, churchgoer, community leader. Reports differ on how much their business was worth, but it ran several homes, made Helmouth a millionaire, and supported a comfortable life. When Hannah's body was discovered by motorists on the 5th of July 1984, investigators quickly realized it was no random roadside killing. The Ontario Provincial Police linked the arrangement to Helmouth. By the 23rd of July 1984, police had charged him with murder. What followed was a 68-day trial that captivated Canadian media. In February 1986, a jury of 10 men and 2 women found Helmouth guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. In court, the darker facets of his life emerged: his use of cocaine, his relationships with prostitutes, the lavish promises that masked desperation. Investigators testified that he'd trafficked in high-end sex workers, entered contracts, and undermined the family he claimed to protect. For Hannah's children, the verdict shattered the illusion of their father as hero. They sat in courtroom rows while the man they called Dad was legally rebuked as killer. Helmouth spent the remainder of his life in prison. On the 1st of November 2007, at age 68, he died at Kingston Penitentiary Hospital after being transferred from Warkworth Institution. Hannah is buried near the small town of Komoka, Ontario, her memory overshadowed by betrayal, greed, and the failure of a man she trusted. Number 9. Larry Rudolph. The morning sun was just breaking over the brushlands of Zambia's Kafue National Park when the quiet of the camp was shattered. Inside a canvas tent, 50-something Bianca Rudolph lay on the floor, a shotgun wound to her chest. Her husband, Lawrence Larry Rudolph, a wealthy Pittsburgh dentist and seasoned hunter, told the guides it was a tragic accident. Bianca, he said, had been packing her 12-gauge when it went off. Zambian police accepted the story. There was no sign of a struggle, and the couple were well-known safari regulars. Within days, Bianca's body was cremated in Zambia. Larry returned to the United States with her ashes, and, as investigators would later learn, the beginnings of a multi-million-dollar insurance trail. Back home, Larry filed 9 separate life insurance claims through 7 different companies, collecting more than $4,877,000. He told friends he was devastated, that Bianca's death had been a freak accident. Yet those who knew him best noticed how quickly his life returned to normal, and how another woman, Lori Milliron, his longtime office manager and girlfriend, seemed to step into the space Bianca had left behind. For years, the story of an accidental shooting went unquestioned, but in 2016, whispers began reaching U.S. authorities. The account of how Bianca's gun had discharged didn't fit the physics of a self-inflicted shot, and there were inconsistencies in how the couple's hunting guides described that morning. The FBI's Denver office reopened the case, using a statute that allows U.S. prosecution of murders of American citizens abroad. Investigators pieced together a far darker picture. Expert analysis showed that Bianca's wound trajectory and gunpowder residue could only have come from a weapon fired from several feet away, not one accidentally discharged in her hands. The gun, they said, had likely been inside its soft-sided carrying case when it was fired, the muzzle angled directly toward her chest. To them, it wasn't an accident. It was an execution staged to look like one. The motive, prosecutors argued, was both money and freedom. Larry had been entangled in a years-long affair with Lori Milliron and wanted to start a new life with her. By killing Bianca on foreign soil, he could claim the insurance, avoid American scrutiny, and make it appear like a tragic mishap in the wilderness. In 2010, federal agents arrested Larry in Denver. The case was brought to trial in the summer of 2022. Over weeks of testimony, jurors heard from forensic experts, hunting guides, and witnesses who described Larry's demeanor after the shooting: calm, composed, and already thinking about travel logistics. One former employee recalled hearing him say to Lori, "I killed my wife for you." On August 2, 2022, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty of the foreign murder of a U.S. national and mail fraud for the insurance claims. The following year, in August 2023, Judge William Martinez sentenced him to life in prison without parole, plus a 20-year term for fraud, a $2 million fine, and restitution of $4,877,744. Lori Milliron was tried separately and found guilty of being an accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, and perjury. In June 2023, she received a 17-year federal sentence. Even behind bars, Larry maintained his innocence, insisting Bianca's death was accidental. But in September 2025, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld both his conviction and the full restitution order. Today, Lawrence Rudolph remains imprisoned, a man who once traveled the world chasing trophies, now remembered for the shot that ended the life of the woman who trusted him most, and for the quiet dawn in the Zambian wilderness where the truth finally began to unravel. Number 10. Robert Hammond. Robert James Hammond had built his entire life around appearances. To friends and neighbors in the quiet village of Histon, near Cambridge, he was the dependable husband, the man who smiled politely at the local shop, the picture of suburban steadiness. But by the autumn of 2023, that image had begun to crumble. His business was failing, his debts had reached nearly £300,000, and the walls were closing in. When his finances fell apart, he began looking at his wife, Cyan Hammond, not as a partner, but as a way out. In the last week of October, Robert paid the overdue premiums on Cyan's life insurance policy, a policy worth £450,000. Just 4 days later, on the night of October 29th, that policy would become the center of a tragedy. Inside their home at Prime's Corner in Histon, Cyan was preparing for bed. The couple had been married nearly 3 decades, but the warmth in their relationship had long cooled. Behind closed doors, Robert's lies had become routine: promises of repayments, invented deals, reassurances that the money was coming. But there was no money, only desperation. At some point between midnight and 12:30, investigators believe, Robert attacked Cyan in their bedroom. The struggle was violent. Forensic experts later found defensive wounds on her arms and face, bruising to her scalp, and clear evidence of neck compression. A fitness tracker on her wrist recorded her heart rate surging between 11:56 p.m. and 12:19 p.m., contradicting Robert's later claim that she had simply collapsed in her sleep. At 2 a.m., Robert dialed 999. In a calm voice, he told the operator he had found his wife unresponsive and didn't know what had happened. He said he'd been sitting downstairs watching television just half an hour earlier, but when paramedics arrived, they noticed things that didn't add up. Cyan was cold to the touch, and Robert hadn't attempted CPR. As detectives began digging, the lies unraveled fast. They discovered his massive debts, the freshly paid-up insurance policy, and internet searches about strangulation. Bank records showed him juggling credit cards and personal loans, on the verge of financial ruin. To investigators, the motive was clear: money. He had strangled his wife to cash in her life insurance payout and erase the mountain of debt threatening to bury him. Robert was arrested the same day. Over the following months, Forensic analysis, digital data, and financial records formed a case too strong to deny. At trial in July 2024, prosecutors told the jury how Hammond's plan had been as calculated as it was cruel. A husband who decided that killing the woman who trusted him was easier than facing the consequences of his own deceit. The jury took just hours to return a guilty verdict. Days later, at sentencing, the judge called him a habitual and accomplished liar who killed for greed and self-preservation. Hammond received a life sentence with a minimum term of 24 years before parole could even be considered. Today, Robert Hammond sits behind bars, a man who once pretended to be in control, undone by the very greed that consumed him. And for those who knew Cyan, a woman described as gentle, kind, and selfless, the hardest truth is that she never saw the danger coming from the person she had loved for nearly 30 years. These stories shows how greed, deception, and desperation can twist the people closest to us. Each case, different names, different places, but the same haunting pattern. Trust turned into tragedy because of money. If you've been watching the channel and haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Stay safe until next time.